Hi guys, it's Rads. So I'm gonna try to make this as quickly as I can. You're at home, so if I get interrupted, apologies in advance. So this is on agriculture and the Green Revolution, which I always find a little interesting. I'll talk about the Green Revolution piece in a minute. But if I were to ask you guys where you think your food comes from, right? Typically, this is the kind of farm that we think of. But in actuality, a lot of our agriculture is very industrialized and very mechanized. And that's really what the Green Revolution brought about. So when we hear the Green Revolution, we tend to think of like green, like being environmentally friendly and good and all that. And this is not that. So don't get that confused. But basically, it's a shift away from those small family farms to more industrial scale agriculture. And truthfully, was very necessary in order to feed the population of people that we have on the planet. So, one of the things that it brought about was a lot more mechanization, irrigation, fertilizers, pesticides, and we also started to really utilize GMOs to try to increase yield of our crops. We did a fantastic job increasing the efficiency of our lands, so we were able to produce more food on less land, and it was more of a short-term profitability. We're seeing some of the downsides of it now, but when it first came about, it was very profitable for people to do. Um, it also decreased world hunger. Like we needed to feed people, and it's been a part of how we've been able to increase Earth's carrying capacity for humans. So again, like we talk about, we're going to talk about a lot of the negatives. Keep in mind that a lot of this was necessary in order to support the population that we have and the population that we continue to have. So I color coded a lot of stuff in these notes. By the way, I'm talking incredibly fast. If you're watching this on like 1.5 speed, lower down because this is going to be too fast. I tried to color code this, and a lot of the negatives are going to come about in red. So we do deal quite a bit with soil conservation and the negative effects of soil between erosion and just the fertility of it. We do have a lot of biodiversity loss, and we deal a bit with groundwater contamination and also overuse of water in general. So those are some of the negatives that came from this. Now, throughout this presentation, I'm going to go through a lot of different things, like all of these, if you were heading it, right? This is the Green Revolution. And then below it, we have all these things that came about with it. Make sure you know at least one pro and at least one con for all of these. If you don't know them all, that's okay. But like a pro and a con is pretty good. So we use a lot more tractors for plowing and tilling fields. We get a lot more yield. It's a lot faster. We need less people. We make more profit. So for the farmers, they're making a little bit more money and doing things in a bit of a more efficient manner. So they're able to farm larger plots of land faster. Now, the problem with this is it relies a lot more on fossil fuels. So we get a lot more greenhouse gases emitted to the atmosphere, which increases climate change. And we know that's not something we want. The other thing is all this heavy machinery really compacts the soil. We know when there's compact soil, there's less water holding capability, which makes it so that the soil is more prone to erosion. Also, if we have compact soil, it's a little more difficult to grow some plants in it without making it not compact, right? Without tilling it up and kind of aerating it. So we also have to factor that in later on down the road. Okay, sorry, I take a little break there. All right, so the other thing that we started to do a lot more is to plant high yield variety crops, HYV crops. So these are genetically modified crops that either produce more yield or have longer growing periods or something along those lines. So if you remember back to maybe biology, when we genetically modify things, we're not like grabbing it out of thin air. In a lot of cases, we're taking a gene from one specific plant variety or something, and we're inserting it into the genes of others and allowing those seeds, we're selling them and planting them and going that way. So we're not like it's not coming out of nowhere, but we're emphasizing what we have. And a lot of them are hybrids. So we're cross pollinating with the different species to kind of get some of those traits. Now, again, increase yield and food stability in regions where they're typically prone to famine. So if you think of a lot of areas that typically would have issues here, they're planting a lot of genetically modified crops because it helps them be able to, again, feed their people. I kind of went through this already, just the GMO piece, right, that we're splicing things in. And again, we splice in genes for lots of reasons. It could be things like I mentioned before about higher yield, longer growing seasons, drought resistance, things like that. But we also can not import, that's the wrong word. We can splice in genes that help us make plants pest resistant to certain things or, along those lines, or stay ripe longer. We do that too, lots of stuff. Now, one thing to just kind of mention here, and I'm sticking this in here because as we're talking about agriculture, we typically think of crops, right? But we also have to think about the fact that we have land use even to raise our lamb, our mutton, our beef, our cattle and things like that. And if we actually look at the amount of land that's used by these different products, lamb and mutton are way up there, followed just behind by beef cattle. So when you're eating those types of meat, just know that you're actually taking up a lot of land. And that goes into the feed that's required for these animals and also the just the space, like the grazing space that they need. We can also look at it in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and this is where it gets a little bit interesting because they break it down kind of by like where it's coming from in that supply chain. But again, beef is way up ahead in terms of greenhouse gas. So not only is it taking up a lot of land, it's taking up a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. And then you've got, again, the other kind of players not too far behind there. All right, I'm going to kind of skip over a lot of this because I talked about it. GMOs are kind of like a high yield variety. It's one type of the high yield variety crops. I already mentioned why we use it. One of the things to kind of mention here is that, again, usually it's used for good things. So BT corn is pretty much all of our corn is BT corn, and it has a gene from a soil bacteria, this Bacillus thuringiensis. And what it does is it actually kills pests. So it's harmless to us and to any of the living things that might be eating it, but to the insects that might be eating it, it's deadly. So it's kind of like a built-in pesticide. The issue with these is that genetically modified crops are genetically identical. So we have no genetic diversity whatsoever. So they get pretty susceptible to disease. And we run the risk, like you guys have seen with some of these like monoculture type things, where if we have something comes in and knocks one plant out, it's going to knock everything out. And that's not good for anyone. Okay. So the other thing that these brought in were the use of synthetic fertilizers. So we talked in my other unit about the Haber-Bosch, because apparently I said it wrong then, process where we're able to make our own synthetic fertilizers rather than from organic fertilizers. So this was a big shift that had happened. So we're using man-made things. Again, you see the theme here, right? Increased yield, increased profits. We've got more nutrients, so we're raising up that limiting factor, so it's not quite so pervasive. But now we run the risk of all these being washed off into waterways. This is where we get eutrophication, or those algal blooms, right? And the process of creating these synthetic fertilizers also uses fossil fuels. So we get those CO2 gases contributing to climate change as well. And lastly, irrigation. We know what irrigation is. We're watering plants. We've got a lot of irrigation technology that has allowed us to grow things in parts of the world we wouldn't normally, they don't get enough rain or whatever the case may be. So we were able to plant on more places because we can irrigate. But the problem is that we deplete a lot of groundwater resources, specifically aquifers, which take a while to recharge. We also know that overwatering can actually be detrimental to plants. We can actually drown them. Believe it or not, plants can drown if they don't have oxygen access at their roots. And it also can lead to soil salinization. Now, we're going to do a whole big lab in class about soil salinization and what that does and like how that happens. So I'm going to leave that, just kind of jot that for now. It is also brought about an increased use in pesticides. So now, like, this is where GM comes in, right? So like genetically modified crops lower it, but because there's less biodiversity, sometimes we have to use different types of pesticides. See in the green theme again, increase yield, increase profit. There's your answer for a test if they ask you for a pro. Now, in terms of cons, again, now we're talking about putting these back into waterways. We're running off. It can harm or kill non-target species. So one of the big ones that happened a while back was DDT. That was in the 1960s. We sprayed it on everything. It was an incredible, incredible pesticide. The problem was that it got into our waterways. It was taken in by the plants in the waterways, which were eaten by the fish, which were eaten by the birds. And what ended up happening was it was thinning the eggs of a lot of those bird shells, and the eggs weren't being able to like actually grow. They were being smushed when mom sat on them. So we figured that out, and they've rebounded. We've also found a lot of atrazine, which is another pesticide. And what we found with atrazine is it actually turns a lot of amphibians and fish intersex, which is impacting their ability to reproduce and thus hurting their populations as well. So I believe this is the FRQ you're going to answer, I think, where you're looking at an advantage and a disadvantage of GM crops. Please note it says environmental advantage and environmental disadvantage. So make sure when you write that, you're focusing on that environmental piece. All right, I'm going to keep going for a little bit. I'll talk about that in class. It's funny. To look at some of the impacts of these agricultural practices. So monocropping is a big one. We plant all the same type of crop exactly where, all in the same place. Super efficient, lets us harvest it really, really, really fast. And it makes it easy to plant a lot, and get it quickly. Again, though, we're decreasing biodiversity. So we know that some of the risks that come with that are they're more prone to pests. They're more likely to be completely decimated or wiped out. We also increase soil erosion because we harvest all those crops at the same time and we leave behind bare soil. And obviously we're decreasing habitat diversity at the same time. So not a great thing there. Okay, almost done. Bear with me. I'm sorry. This is a long one. So the other thing is going to be tilling. So tilling is like you see this big thing here. We go in and we kind of mix up the soil. So you remember we were dealing with the fact that mechanization was leading to soil compaction, which is an issue when we're trying to plant things because we need those roots to be able to grow. We need oxygen in aeration spaces. So we do this. It helps. They grow. It's great. The problem is that we are loosening up that soil enough so now we've got increased erosion. We're breaking up all of that, and we found a lot of evidence that shows that when you break up those root structures after harvesting, you're actually impacting the future generations of those plants from doing what they need to do. So not great. We also lose a lot of the organic matter in the topsoil over time when we do this. And it's dusty. We get a lot of PM, stands for particulate matter, into the air, which is a respiratory irritant for a lot of people. And also we end up with a lot of that in nearby water. So leading to turbidity of that water, which we know affects the ability of sunlight to get to the plants. Not good for those ecosystems either. Okay, so slash and burn we're going to hit on quickly because we already had that lovely presentation on it. So we don't have to do a ton, but just know that obviously if we're cutting down vegetation and we're burning it, we've got a loss of habitat, but we have more land for agriculture. That's the big take home from that. We do release a lot of greenhouse gases from this, carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide and nitrous oxide mainly. Those also aren't great for air quality, so not good for people who have asthma and respiratory issues along those lines. All right. I already talked about synthetic fertilizers, so I'm going to kind of skip over a lot of this. The one big thing I will point out is this part here. You can't see my cursor, I don't think, but it doesn't return organic matter back to the soil, right? So when we're putting down organic fertilizers, things like compost and manure, we're cycling a lot of that organic matter back into the soil. So when we use synthetic fertilizers, we're impacting the fertility of that soil in future generations. So that's something we have to think about. I already talked about eutrophication. Now, this side, I'm skipping. We're going to talk about all of this in class. Don't write it down. Skip it. If you watch this, good. You don't have to do it. What we are going to look at, though, is how this overwatering leads to waterlogging and what that can do to plants. And again, we're going to talk about a lot of this in class, so I'm not going to spend time here talking about it. But I do want you to know that overall, if we're talking about any kind of irrigation, the most efficient type of irrigation we can use is drip irrigation because it's going to keep the water right by the roots where they need it. It's going to allow them to, the soil to remain aerated. We don't have to worry about some of the other issues that come along with overwatering. The problem is it's really expensive. So we have to find a trade-off in some cases. I'm skipping this because we're going to talk about it in class. So this, if you want to write something down again, you can write down what it is and a solution. But again, the solution is drip irrigation. All the solutions, drip irrigation. It's your best answer. It's not letting me go. Oh, because that's the last slide. Okay, so we're good. We're done. Yay. Make sure you go back and answer the FRQ. Apologies that this is so long and that I talked so fast and that you couldn't watch it on 2x speed. And I will see you in class. Thanks, guys.